Welcome, everyone. I'm Valerie Renke with the Diocese of Olympia, the Episcopal Church in Western Washington. Thank you for taking the time to join in on this presentation on faith formation in a changing church, learning from the past, and preparing for the future with Sharon Ely Pearson. Earlier this month, Sharon would have been our keynote speaker at the Diocese of Olympia's annual Faith Formation mini-conference, Better Together. That event was one of the first in the diocese to be canceled because of COVID-19, but thanks to video conferencing, we can now create the illusion, if not the actual feel, of togetherness. On behalf of Bishop Greg Rickel and the whole diocese, thank you, Sharon, for agreeing to deliver your remarks in spite of it all.
Thank you.
Let me properly introduce Sharon. She wears many hats, but you probably know her best as an author, blogger, educator, and faith formation cornerstone of the Episcopal Church. Recently retired as editor and Christian formation specialist with Church Publishing Incorporated, Sharon brings over 30 years of experience in Christian ed for children, youth, and adults on the local, diocesan, and churchwide level. She has written and published numerous books, including the bestseller Call on Me, a prayer book for young people, as well as the classic Episcopal Christian Educator's Handbook, and most recently, the delightful 6-book series, Faithful Celebrations, Making Time for God. She earned her master's in Christian education from Virginia Theological Seminary and is the founder of Building Faith, a website and e-newsletter now sponsored by the seminary, an amazing online resource that I know many of us use all the time. Active in Forma, the network for Christian formation for the Episcopal Church. She's also a regular contributor to numerous publications in the church and beyond. She leads workshops and retreats on a variety of formation topics, and you can follow her on her blog, roseofsharon.com. She is so prolific, she does not seem human, but you should also know she has a very human life. She lives in Connecticut with her husband, John, a cat named Shadow, and Chobi, an 8-year-old black lab she rescued. She and John have 2 adult children. They're both teachers and a 5-year-old granddaughter. I'll turn it over now to Sharon Ely Pearson. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Valerie. And it's wonderful to be with all of you across 3,000 miles as we're all living a new way in a new time and space, for sure. So I'm with you from Norwalk, Connecticut. Like I said, I'm on the East Coast. So let us begin with prayer. The Lord be with you. Dear God, thank you for giving the blessings of community, education, staying connected, and our health. We pray that we have the ability to help others in need in the time that is at hand, and that those who are lonely have the comfort and presence of you. We trust you to lead us to use our blessings to bless others and pray for others in need. Amen. That prayer was written via Zoom by the 6th and 7th graders at my parish where I worship in Wilton, Connecticut. So I thought that was a nice way for us to start. We're going to be talking about the past, the present, the future. And I know the present and the future are very much on our minds as we're trying to figure out how to be church, be faithful people with those that we love in a new paradigm. So I'm going to share a little bit of history to start off with and start with my own story and the story of my family. I'm an anomaly. I've always known that the Episcopal Church welcomes me. That went for my parents, both sets of my grandparents, my aunts and my uncles. We all lived in the same town and went to the same church. I was baptized, confirmed, and married in the same Episcopal church that my parents were married at, and my children were baptized in, with one of them being confirmed there. But 60 years later, showing my age, that same building, church building in Norwalk, Connecticut, is now an Islamic center. That church closed because of economics, because of eating up its endowment, not being valued by and for the neighborhood that grew up around it. That totally changed. and so decided to close. And the Episcopal Church in Connecticut sold the building to an Islamic center. So it is still a place of worship, but definitely not the place or the use of that building that my parents or grandparents knew, or I did as a child. So that's part of our changing church now. How do we connect with the community around us and change to meet the needs of those communities while still being faithful to who we are? The church raised my children, this same church. However, neither my children nor my 5-year-old granddaughter go to church these days, except when they visit me, and they'll come Christmas, Easter. So they're Christmas, Easter Episcopalians. However, they continue to be active in our diocesan summer camp, which is really the place that formed them. So now that we know that we're in the year 2020, it's very different than it was for my grandmother 100 years ago when she attended Sunday school. So I'm an amateur genealogist, and I love history. And so you're going to be seeing a little blasts from the past from me. And several generations have changed since then, and so has lots of other things in the church and where Sunday school actually started. So you may think some of what I'm going to start talking about will be about old wives' tales around the campfire, but hopefully some of this will resonate for some of you that have experienced this, and for some of you who haven't, will be a learning. So, and we've got help in changing our slides. So if we could go to the next one, that would be super. Thank you. Here we have the Shema from Deuteronomy 6, chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. This is the beginning of Christian education. What it was for the history of the Jewish people was a record of their relationship with God as expressed in covenant. And that's how the education system really grew up. That family was the primary piece of education for them. And we know in the and that was the Old Testament that has been forwarded to us and is part of our heritage that we teach. But then we know that Jesus taught in parables, and his followers saw him as a primary source of rabbinic teaching. So his teaching was very unstructured. He used stories to illustrate what a central truth was, what he believed was the gospel, what becomes the gospel to us in many ways, but how his relationship with God was a model for our relationship with God. He used dialogue, comparisons, poetry, hyperbole, and puns and jokes. I think we can think of Jesus as having had a sense of humor also. Next slide, please. When we move into the Apostolic Church, that early church, we realize that they were living in a culture that they were surrounded by that was not Christian, very much like the culture we're living in today, especially those of us on the East Coast and on the West Coast. Not so much in the middle of the country or in the South yet, but they're getting there. And that the importance of, in the early church, was to really maintain what that gospel message was and help spread that. So the duty of teachers might have been to educate new converts, those adults who were getting ready to become Christians, who were preparing for the anticipation of their baptism. So this time of year for sure, right before Easter, using Lent as a catechumenal period to teach and to learn things. And so the things that you see on the screen are from lots of places, but a particular resource that I think is really good for all formation people to read is Fashion Me a People by Maria Harris. And in that book, she really talks about what we are called to teach. And this follows in the apostolic teachings of the church. So one is the koinonia, is the curriculum of being in community. So today, that's us. We are the community gathered to learn together. There is the liturgia, which is the curriculum of prayer. How do we teach prayer? That's where our word of liturgy comes from. The didache, the curriculum of teaching. What are the elements that we really want to teach? A lot of those are from the teachings of the apostles and other writers that have gone before us. Certainly, as Episcopalians, our Bible and our prayer book. The kerygma, the curriculum of proclamation. Once we learn stuff, how are we proclaiming it and telling the good news to others? And then there's the diaconia, the curriculum of service. How do we go out into the world with that proclamation and serve others? All of this is very similar to our baptismal covenant also. So this is the early first century church, which still continues today. And when I help folks look at curriculum, I say, where are these 5 key ingredients? And so I believe this will hold us to the future also. How can we tap into these to really have a robust program, no matter what kind of form that it's being taken as? So the modern Christian education, where we are today in that, really originated in the Renaissance and the Reformation, not as part of the apostles' teaching and fellowship and breaking bread, or that first instruction and first creed from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, which really all is Jesus is Lord. That's what was taught. Jesus is Lord. So in the Renaissance, the Reformation, what happened is we became rational beings. Perhaps we lost a little of imagination, but there was a hunger for knowledge, head stuff, what's in the head, and that's what people were seeking. They were seeking to be informed and learn to know more. And despite all the suffering and things that were caused by war, by plagues, by revolutions during those periods of history, people had a hunger for God. And saints like, I know some of you might realize that I'm a big fan of Julian of Norwich, who lived during the Black Plague. That's when she had her revelations in her showings. And so she realized that in this suffering, God is still present. Next slide, please. Now we're going to jump to more modern times. So we'll talk about like 1700s, 1800s, and when the Sunday school movement really started, totally separate from that apostolic church model. But it was out of the optimism of how do we help people who are suffering or who are in need that the Sunday school movement was born. The Sunday school actually traces its roots back to the late 18th century. England was shifting from an agrarian to an industrial society. Capitalization was surging along with urbanization. However, those who lived in the cities tended to be those who were of lower economic means. Their conditions were miserable. Housing, clothing, nutrition, sanitation, education was poor for these families. So there was a man who was associated with a publishing company, a family, an editor. He felt that, and no one worked on Sundays, so what did the children do? They roamed the streets, those that were uneducated, and they became what they said were uncontrolled and uncontrollable. So this man, Robert Raikes, came and realized the church is open on Sundays. We can help these children. And so his main effort then was to bring children into churches because they were considered vile creatures, and they needed some discipline. And so in a place called Sooty Alley, where there was a prison nearby and chimney sweeps lived, he opened a school on Sundays, and they taught personal hygiene, discipline, and literacy training. And of course, the only thing that they had for literacy training was the Bible. So children learned how to read by reading from the Bible. And that was called the Sunday school. Somehow, the Sunday school moved from teaching disadvantaged children how to read and write and behave properly ended up being part of the missionary work of the church, especially the Methodist Church. John Wesley took this, he brought it to the United States, and it grew from there as a way to teach the Bible. That. Next slide, please. And this is where you're going to see my genealogy and my other pieces. And thank you to Carrie for being the man behind the curtain with this. Who's must be having some technical difficulties. Well, hopefully that picture will come up. And then here we go. Because this is one of my favorite pieces that you're going to see here. What you'll see here is my family. Starting on the left-hand side that you see here, this is my grandmother, Edna Catherine Hess Haas, who was born in 1898. She is the girl with the pigtails, looking very sad and somber on the far left. She was baptized and confirmed at St. Paul's Episcopal Anglican Church in Norwalk, Connecticut, which still exists today, which is sort of the mother church of Norwalk, Connecticut, where I grew up. From my genealogy research, I discovered that she received 2 small volumes from the Sunday school that she attended, was a Book of Common Prayer and the hymnal when she was 7 years old. And I have both of those books. The pages of morning prayer are very worn, so you could tell that she used that. They're dog-eared, there are pencil markings in it. And the hymnal is marked up on hymn 834, also with a pencil. She was a member of, and I'm going to get some show and tell here, hopefully that I can show you, of the Girls Friendly Society. So here is, whoops, which way am I going toward that? This is a pin, it's a little hard to see, there you go, of the Girls Friendly Society, which was an organization which still exists in the Episcopal Church today for young girls that at that time were to teach etiquette, proper behavior for a young lady, and to learn to follow Jesus. They also received little Sunday school pins, and you'll see this one says, and this may look familiar because I had one of these when I was a child also. So this is that was her Sunday school pin. She completed her education, formal education in the public schools in 6th grade. She is considered one of the lost generation, a generation that lived between 2 world wars. She lived through the Great Depression, the shaking finger of missionary parents at that time, because the whole part of religion was going out and being a missionary to spread the gospel in foreign lands to people who needed to be able to learn about Jesus. Her religious education in Sunday school had a lot to do with memorizing things, learning things like the Lord's Prayer, things like this. But also part of it was that John Dewey in the educational system at this period of time was viewing education as a social process towards social ends. So it was supposed to be, education was supposed to be child-centered and motivated from within. Even though my grandmother had to memorize a lot of things, a lot of it that she did in her Sunday school was worshiping and learning, active and experiential learning for that. And that was considered very progressive at the time and was looked down upon a lot by the church in far as teaching, that thing that was going on in other places in education. So we need to keep that in mind for our future point. The next picture over is my mother, Trinette Emily Haas Ely, and she was born in 1926, again in Norwalk, Connecticut. She attended Grace Church in Norwalk, the church that I grew up with. And it was a mission of St. Paul's, which was like 2 miles away from that. She was confirmed in Groton, Connecticut, because it was at the time of the outbreak of World War II, and my grandfather worked for Electric Boat, predecessor of submarines today. But she did not attend Sunday school at the church. That's where they might have gone on Sunday, maybe, probably Easter and Christmas, because they lived too far away from the church and they didn't have a car. My grandfather did, but at the time when my mother was young, as far as I know, he had nothing to do with driving her to church, them to church at all. So my mother walked to a Union Sunday school, which was broad-based, and I have her Sunday school pin, and it says, it's a little bit bigger, but it looks exactly the same. Oops. And it says Union on it. I think my letters are backwards in this. But she went to a mission Sunday school and learned her Bible stories and things like that for that. When she grew up, got married, and if we could slide the photo over a little bit, she was this, let me talk about her generation first. So she was of the silent generation. She was a child during the Great Depression, stock market crashed. Her childhood was cut short, as I mentioned, that she ended up having to leave her hometown, she went to high school in Groton and graduated from there with mostly a class of women because all the men and boys were off to war. She also participated in the Girls Friendly Society at her local church, and whoops, this was her button that she had for that. Public education and religious education, both at the time, were focused on being productive citizens. This is when Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, 4-H clubs, vocational education was really important. So girls took home economics. Boys, if they were around, took industrial education, very gender-specific education. And there was a pushback on experiential kind of learning as far as reading and mathematics. As far as the church goes, when we moved to my generation, so this silent generation became super active in the church when they all came home from war. And if we could slide that, and if you can see the rest of the slides there, I can't on my screen. The next photo on this slide is of me. And there's a picture of myself with my parents. I was born in 1955. I'm a baby boomer. I went to church every Sunday along with my cousins, my grandparents, my parents, aunts and uncles. Certainly for Sundays, which is what this photo is of, we've hat, white gloves, patent leather shoes, and frilly white socks, and certainly a dress for girls. Other pictures I have of my brother have him in a little bow tie, little jacket, little sports jacket, miniature size thing. But my parents were super involved. My mother taught Sunday school. She was involved in the women's club, all of those kinds of things. She led the Girls Friendly Society, and I had this little ring that I remember wearing as a child, which was probably my grandmother's, is my guess. My dad was a lay reader. He was on vestry. He was on the building committee. He was in doing all those man things. What I remember from my Sunday school, and I had one of those pins, of course, I can't find it. I'll probably find it tomorrow, is the same pin except I had bars on it for all of the years that I would come to Sunday school. And I would be like 13 years old and I might have 17 bars, which really became a joke for a lot of us because they would award these things very much on reward system 2 times a year, Christmas and Easter. And since I was in church every Sunday, because my parents were, I would get an award 2 times a year for showing up for that. But there were blue laws at the time. Nothing was open on Sundays. No way would schools have something. There wasn't sports. My Sunday school memories involve coloring pictures, listening to Bible stories, all taught by women, and having closely graded classes. But there were tons of us. Baby boomers were all over the place. So it was a time when moms stayed home and took care of the kids. Dads worked to pay the bills. Things seemed pretty uncomplicated until much later on. There we go. So you see my mom and me and my dad. And then, so as a baby boom, now my kids, well, let me go back and talk about where's the Episcopal Church in all of this. At this period of time when I was a child, the Protestant Episcopal Church, or PCUSA, as we were known then instead of TEC, the Episcopal Church, the curriculum we used stressed learning skills over subject matter, social relevance over timeless facts. It was really important at that period of time, but then there was a shift. The Seabury series was a curriculum that the Episcopal Church published its own curriculum that every church was supposed to use in age-segregated classrooms. Units focused on Jesus, Christmas, Easter, Bible heroes, those kinds of things. But also units focused on giving of your time, your talent, your treasure. So money was taught, how to be a good steward. Behavior in church was taught, how to use the hymnal, how to use the prayer book, how to live by a code of faith. So the Seabury curriculum was used widely for a very short period of time, but it did not catch on because it was not able to be lived out fully. Family services in church were morning prayer. Children and adults were segregated for the most part. I don't remember going to worship with my parents except when we had a special service. So children had a separate sanctuary. I remember mine being in a gym or something. And church school teachers were with us. I was in church on Easter and maybe Christmas at the time. So we were definitely segregated from that, but it didn't matter. It was morning prayer. We could do morning prayer separate from each other, and we couldn't receive communion. I first received communion when I was 13, when I was confirmed. So that was a big understanding theologically of what it meant to be a member of the church at that time was by confirmation, and we know that's not the same today. The last one are my children, who are millennials, although both of them say they are not. My son was born in 1985, my daughter in 1982. My daughter especially says that she's on the cusp of being a millennial because she is not a digital native, but she's fully connected today. So she feels that she straddles it. She's just trying to get, her own generational name herself. But both of them were raised in the Episcopal Church, but they always knew from the moment they put out their hand that they could receive communion by virtue of their baptism. So while I grew up with the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, they grew up with the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. So there was a huge shift, but still not so much with them because they still had segregated by age church school classes. There was curriculum that they used. They grew up with lectionary curriculum, which was new at that period of time, Living the Good News. And then the Episcopal Church, when they decided not to produce a curriculum, others filled that void, and the Episcopal Children's Curriculum, which was published by Virginia Theological Seminary, was that. For my children today, as millennials, their focus, they call themselves Christians, their focus on what it means to be a Christian is living it out in the world. They find God in a variety of different places. They talk about it with my granddaughter. My granddaughter they depend on me to talk about it with my granddaughter. and my granddaughter knows that I'm the person that goes to church. And when she sees a cross or she sees something related to that, she'll say to my daughter, Grandma would like that. How we've changed from that period of time. Next slide, please. So this is where the Episcopal Church fits in with all of this. There was definitely paradigm shifts from my generation and my parents' generations of the 1950s and the 1970s to 2020 today. Like I'd mentioned, in the 50s, there was 28 Book of Common Prayer, and it was morning prayer was the center of worship. The Seabury series were very closely worked curriculum in which a teacher did all the teaching. It was didactic learning. And there was definitely closely graded segregation in curriculum. In the 70s, we had a new prayer book, which many still call new. There was a new theology of baptism. Confirmation was looked at differently, and there was really the centrality of the Eucharist. In looking at some of the things that were going on in the church at this time, I found this button that said doubling the church by 2020. It was a grassroots, or it was an Episcopal evangelism movement. So this was in the, I'm going to say it was the 80s, and it was called Building Up the Body of Christ. And this is the button that was handed out to everybody. So we were to double the size of the church by 2020. We know that didn't happen for that. So what went wrong during this time? The church, the shift in all of this is the church started taking responsibility for educating children, and parents abdicated it. This is all my opinion. Not necessarily across the board with all people, but generally in the public, that's, I believe, what has happened. I don't think we educated well enough in the Book of Common Prayer that we now use. And as John Westerhoff had said, which comes out of the 80s and into the 90s, that faith is caught, not taught. That. Next slide, please. There are a number of initiatives that have come out of the Episcopal Church to try to fill that void and help us all embrace what Christian formation originally intended, if we go way back to that apostolic teaching of the apostles. And so there was lots of grassroots movements that came to sort of, how do we embrace children? How do we embrace young people? How do we do more experiential learning? And so out of those things came Godly Play in recent years, Journey to Adulthood program, which is in its revision right now. The Education for Ministry, EFM program, that helped lay people and adults have a theological education to be able to do theological reflection, that things aren't so much dependent on those who are ordained or have gone to seminary, that we are in partnership together. The Episcopal Church adopted 2 resolutions, one that is repeated several times, and that's the Children's Charter for the Church. Hopefully all of you know about this. I know the handouts that were sent to you with some links and other things in advance of this that you would have gotten if we were all together, person to person and face to face. You would have seen the Children's Charter for the Church that calls all of us, not just teaching Sunday school, to nurture children, to ministry to children, and accept the ministry of children to us. And in this framework, children at the time were considered between the ages of 0 and 18. Another one is the Charter for Lifelong Christian Formation, which really lifts up the importance of adult formation in our church. On the previous slide, you saw a picture of a book called Called to Teach and Learn. This was the Episcopal Church's response, I believe in 1994, for us to really look at pedagogy and how we teach. and that we need to be experiential. We need to go back to our baptismal promises, and that document, which was mailed, it was a book, it was in book form, was mailed to every single church. Most people didn't know what to do with it. Oh, we got a free book from our Episcopal Church Center. And working in many churches and helping clean out many church closets, I would discover these copies of these books. The book's no longer available, but thankfully someone digitized the files, and in the materials that I sent to all of you, there are links for that document. Like I said, it was published in the early 90s, so the black and white photos that are in it really aged the document, but the content itself is not. There is another document that goes with it that is helps you unpack it and how to share it with that. So let's move to present time. That's what we're anxious to hear about. So next slide, please. You are doing a great job here. We know that there are lots of generational changes that have happened now. One of the images on this slide is something that was just in the Christian Century a little while ago about how many are Christian, people that consider themselves Christian, other faiths, and unaffiliated. So our population is changing a lot. We know that from who is in church on Sunday. There's a rise of nuns, N-O-N-E-S's. There's a drop in membership. Finances in our churches are different now. There's a thought of subsidiarity in which not top down, but grassroots up needs to be creating the resources and not given from our church-wide body. And in many dioceses, you folks are more fortunate than a lot of others that you've got staff that help support you in this. Lots of others, dioceses, it's up to the local level to figure a lot of this stuff out. We're living in a global society now. We know that for sure now, with the spread of all kinds of things. We're living in a world of technology, thanks be to God. We're highly mobile, and I was going to mention that we are in a time before any of this happened, that we're in a time of terrorism, anxiety, and pandemics for that. And the next slide, please. And if we could move over on this slide, hopefully all of you can see the matrix that's in front of you on this. You will see that this was a project that I was involved in 10 years ago. So in 2010, John Roberto, who's a member of the Lifelong Faith Associates, he is Lifelong Faith Associates, and we are today as we're talking about his work. I was part of a group that put together a matrix that looked about who are the people in this world, in the United States and specifically that we're looking at. We know there are people who are very receptive to organized religion, and there are those who are very resistant to organized religion. So those are the tops and the bottoms of that matrix. And then on the side is where do they fall in between that? They're either high or low in those. And we developed 4 quadrants for that where people fit. For all of you here, I am assuming that we would be scenario number 1. We are highly receptive to organized religion, and we have a high hunger for God and the spiritual life. So we're in church on Sunday, or we're practicing prayer. We're doing all of these things. So part of this matrix, and you have that in the documents I sent, talk about how do we engage people in faith formation that are in that quadrant. The other quadrant that we also have in scenario 4 on the upper left-hand side are those who are receptive to organized religion. These are the folks in my parish who have their children baptized, and then we see them again with their kids when they want their kid to be confirmed. They show up at Christmas, Easter. So they're, the organized religion, they are a member of this church, but they don't have a real hunger or a deep spiritual connection to God. So they show up when life passages. Suddenly we're doing a funeral for someone that no one knows who they are. And we look back in the church records. Yeah, okay, they were here. So how do we minister to them? How do we engage them? And probably that's a ready audience. And perhaps that's an audience that is finding our church now, who are coming back to have live services online, to connect in some ways while they're sequestered at home, because they're realizing, we have God in the midst of all of this difficulty and this trauma that so many are experiencing. And how are we living in a desert this Lent at this time? Then the other scenarios are ones that are unaffiliated and uninterested, low on all counts. And then the other are those that are spiritual but not religious. Maybe this is a time also that they're hungry, and they're finding us through technology and things like this. So those are on the other documents. So that's one way to kind of look at the future and what there are. So we did this 10 years ago, thinking about what would it look like in the year 2020 and how might we minister to folks like that or reach out to folks like that. And the documents I sent you, you have lots of links to all the material that has to do with that. Next slide, please. And this is the part that I'm going to change up a little bit. And I think there's a picture of my granddaughter on there, and that's her dressed up for Easter. So that whole part about getting dressed up at Easter time, that still translates past generations. So my granddaughter Mackenzie, who's going to be 5 in a couple weeks, is considered part of Gen Alpha. She is one of those children that are in our churches, hopefully, along with those that were Gen Z generation that were born late 90s up to 2010. And so they are digital natives. Everything is online. My 5-year-old granddaughter she watched her teacher read a story on her iPad today. And part of that, so we're going to kind of quickly go to this, that what are our future generations going to be facing? And I think we're already into the future from what I had prepared, several weeks ago to share with you. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This comes from, and I'm going to share a brochure with you, which is not available anymore, and I don't have permission to make copies of it. But you have a link in the documents that came out from the Diocese of Olympia. And if some of you do not have access to these, if you've signed in to this webinar, most likely we've got your email address and they can be digitally sent to you for all of these. But this comes out from the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes a couple years ago, engaged a company called the Institute for the Future, which is located in California. And they did a study of the Episcopal Church and wanted to give us some provocations. What are some things that we're going to need to pay attention to in the world that's coming up? And they first called this a VUCA World, VUCA. And it has surprised me, so I'm also looking at that document to be able to share with you. What they shared here came out in, so it was a 2008 to 2018 forecast of what are the forces that are going to be affecting the Episcopal Church. And we are seeing a lot of these right now, even before for this. So let me explain what VUCA means exactly. V is volatility, a world that's experienced volatility. U stands for uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen next. C stands for complexity, and A stands for ambiguity. It certainly doesn't sound hopeful. However, we can change those letters, VUCA, VUCA, to something else. We could take the V and move it to vision, the uncertainty to understanding, the complexity to clarity, and the ambiguity to agility. Things to keep in mind. And remembering back to my grandmother's time of that generation that lived through horrible times of a depression, other kinds of things, World War I, they were living in that same type of world as we are today, just in a little different ways from that. So some of the things that we are seeing in this are the provocations, and I'm flipping through my thing here, are, there are a whole bunch of them, but I want to highlight some of them. Smart networking, that we know social networks exist at this period of time. We're using them like crazy these days. So how can we use, and I think we're doing this too, smart networking in our churches for Christian formation, for forming community, for forming discipleships? So the question comes out, how might your church function more like a social network and less like a hierarchy of, all the conversations about having, which theologically is wrong, watching our clergy person celebrate Eucharist and then we break bread and have wine at home. Do not do that. I'm not giving you permission to do that. But, so there's that whole piece about how can we get rid of that hierarchy and how can we help people pray at home without having others in leading us do that? How can we help set up altars in our homes at this period of time? So how can we use this social networking to promote those things? And that goes into the digital physical blend, in which sometimes some of those seem like the same thing, that we're going to be so much more digitally and visually connected to one another. So a question, how might you, which is so funny, these questions are so applicable, how might you reimagine your congregation as both a physical and virtual presence in the lives of the members of your congregation, but also of your community, beyond your church buildings? All the signs that are going up now are showing little cartoons of where is the church with arrows pointing everywhere and not necessarily the church building. The rich-poor gap, we know that exists today. Extreme climate variability, we know that exists today also. The other one that really struck me too is that we've got the whole health crisis, and they were predicting pandemics and those kinds of things. So how do we live in this kind of world? Because what they predicted only a few years ago has come in place today. And we are using our technology very well in doing that. I'm looking at the time. Go ahead, the next slide, please. I want to allow enough times for some questions. So things that we can be doing, and I think we're doing these digitally very much now, is focusing at faith at home. There's a hunger. Parents want to be able to do this, but we know from previous generations, baby boomers, perhaps Gen X, did not learn how to do this. We memorized a lot of stuff. So how do we learn how to practice what we learned? How can we help teach parents to pray with their children? For young adults to be able to set up a prayerful place, to be experimentally focused on how the technology can help us, and sharing our personal stories. What are our hopes and our dreams? At this time, where are we experiencing sorrow? How can we help lament so many young people who may not be confirmed this year as planned, who may not actually have a senior prom or a high school or college graduation. How can the church be present for those times and create rituals? How is Sunday school not on Sundays? How can we, I think we were figuring that out. It doesn't have to be on Sunday for all of those kinds of things. Next slide, please. And I think this may be the last one. We are seeing resurgence in the catechumenate, in which whole parishes are looking at the seasons of the church year and doing teaching as a whole community around those. Doing faith at home. I've mentioned that several times. Using faith practices, teaching people faith practices that they can take on and experiment on their own. And certainly intergenerational, parents and children, but also how do we involve grandparents and all ages together? Doing confirmation intergenerationally, pairing with mentors and all of those kinds of things. So this is what I see in the future, and I think we can still do this digitally as we are. I'm going to stop here just because we're running out of time. And my guess is there are questions because I see little arrows popping up in my in the queue. Thanks, Valerie.
Sharon, that was wonderful. Thank you. People are welcome to go to chat and write up a question if they have one. There was some confusion about the documents. I haven't posted the documents, so that's
okay.
That I will be happy to do. As you mentioned, I have a list of everybody who's participating in the webinar, so I can immediately, following this presentation, send those documents out to everybody. Mm-hmm. I had a question to start, and
sure.
I loved your faith is caught, not taught.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you could just sort of flesh that out a little bit, what you mean by that.
Sure. That phrase comes from John Westerhoff, and it is from his book, Will Our Children Have Faith?, which is another book that I really recommend folks read, whether you work with children or not, because it really lays out how we grow developmentally, from starting as small children, from experiential learning. That's how we come into relationship with God, is through our senses, through being loved by others. That's how we know God. And then we experience God through experimenting and doing other things, by reading, by hearing about the stories of God when we're in elementary school. That, certainly continues to grow. Then we get, when we get to be teenagers, or that questioning part, that's where we learn about God, is by searching. So by being able to not be taught stuff that we need to learn and then regurgitate back, but how are we taught where we can actually experience the presence of God with us? So if we're going to, for an example, that faith is caught, not taught, how can we get people to catch and experience things? We did a Taizé service last spring, an intergenerational one at my parish. We have a number of, we have several kids on the autism spectrum. So we made prayer bottles that were like sensory bottles for kids who have autism. Find very soothing. But we took the readings from the vigil and we found symbols for each of them. And as we went through with Taizé music, we would read one of the lessons. Everyone, adults included, so all ages were present, would go to a station, and for creation, water was the water of baptism, that they filled their bottles with water. Then I think we had like blue sequins for water, that they went and put blue sequins in the bottle. We had little bones, little plastic bones for the reading from Ezekiel in the Valley of Bones. So it was experiential, but we were teaching prayer at that same time. And I think the adults got more out of it than the kids did, because they were like, wow, I never experienced and learned scripture before by doing it. I think that's what John means when he talks about faith is caught, not taught. As adults, we are living examples of our faith, and those, whether they're adults or children or whoever's around us, are going to learn about faith and what it means to be a Christian by watching how we act as Christians. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right, so we have a comment from Sue Tate, who is our diocesan resource librarian, you know.
Hey, Sue.
And she says we have copies of all the books that Sharon mentioned, including Will Our Children Have Faith, in the Resource Center. So any of these books that are piquing your curiosity, you should be definitely checking in with Sue and can put that information out as well.
Mm-hmm.
Bishop also says he has no questions. He wanted to thank you, everyone who attended today. Really awesome. So Josh Hostler, oh, let's go. Wait, sorry, Josh.
Hey, Josh.
Yeah, all your friends watching. Let's go to Karen first, since she posted first. She asked if you could repeat the volatile to vision, ambiguity to agility. She says she's in missing middle too, and I did jot those down if you don't have them.
Okay, let me turn to I also have this very cool thing that is very visual, which I like, that I'm going to see if I mean, it's been out a long time. Where did it go? If I can find it. It's two-sided, so, oh, here we go. Volatility leads to vision. So volatility, vision. Uncertainty yields to understanding. Uncertainty, understanding. Complexity yields to clarity. Complexity to clarity. And ambiguity yields to agility. Ambiguity, agility.
Right.
Another piece that I'm looking at this document, they share that is agility is the practice of faith. Since predetermined action is brittle in a VUCA world, the volatility world, riddled with surprises, an agent of change, who I think what we are being called to do, must be both practiced and agile. You need to prototype your way to success and fail in constructive ways. So try new things, try things. If it doesn't work, move on, try something new. And I think that's sort of what we're doing. Those of you before this call, we were really trying to make this work so I would be able to control my own slides. So, you know, we've been making lemonade out of a lot of lemons throughout these past weeks.
It's required a lot of agility for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Josh Hostler, he says he would love to see a full list of the things you did with the vigil readings.
Okay, that is on my Rose of Sharon, ROWS of Sharon.com. That's
okay,
up there.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's thinking about what we might do along those lines in our virtual Easter vigils.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So is that something he can also find there as part of the package, or?
That wasn't, well, because I wasn't thinking of it at the time when I sent you things,
Right.
but I can send you a link to those, and I may have a document that I can share. I was on a call earlier this morning with my rector and our children's and youth ministers in planning our Holy Week, because it's all going to be, you know, virtual, and we're trying to make it experiential with people creating altars in their homes, and every day of Holy Week, we're going to be offering a way to continue to construct that altar using the readings for the day. So I will share that with you also once we get that finalized.
Great. One question here too from Jennifer Gamber. I'd love
Jennifer. Okay. Washington, D.C.
Is that right? Great.
Yeah.
I'd love to know your thoughts about passive discipleship for children and youth. How does this fit in models of faith formation for our churches today? So thoughts and paths of discipleship. Children.
Well, Jennifer can probably answer this question herself as she's working on this. I think, well, for one, what the Episcopal Church has given us is the way of love as ways to do that, and just to go deeper in all of those 7 practices. And Bishop Rickle certainly is very familiar with all of that, being on the Presiding Bishops' Council. But I think those can be different pathways depending on age level for doing those things. You know, how are we on a pathway of prayer, knowing that we are all, you know, in different ages and stages. There are some folks that are very steeped in prayer, but maybe not in Bible, or maybe not in being able to go out into the world and to engage others in sharing their faith story. So a great question. You know, the whole one of John Westerhoff's more recent, so in the 3rd edition of his book, Will Our Children Have Faith, he talks about faith development more as pathways, and that we are constantly moving in and out of all of those stages. But what are those milestones along the way that help us move from searching to experiential to acclaimed faith? So I think I would look back at what he has written on that. Good question. I'll have to do that too.
From Jason Anderson, he says, we have a handful of grandparents who regularly bring their grandchildren to godly worship. What resources might you recommend to those grandparents to help bridge the missing generation together with the faith community? Or what ways might we work to pull the missing generation back into the fold, so to speak?
That's the ultimate question from a lot of folks. And I think grandchildren will help lead us too. Jerome Berryman recently wrote a book called Stories of God at Home, which is beautiful. There are small, I mean, this is an expense also, but if people are creative, they can make them. There are small godly play boxes that can be purchased that go along with. So Jerome has rewritten a number of the story. I think there are 6. I edited it, I should know. That, you know, so there's Easter, there's Advent, a parable of the Good Shepherd, in which families can do these stories at home. For that, I'd recommend reading or following Wendy Claire Berry. In her book, Faith at Home, really talks about how do we celebrate things in life at home that we don't know about, that, you know, if we've never experienced themselves. So I'd recommend following her and her blog, her book. There's a number of Build Faith is a great resource for that, Building Faith. So that's buildfaith.org. And Grow Christians from Forward Movement is all about supporting households at home, whatever that configuration might be, whether it's grandparents or caregivers. So those are really good resources I would recommend for that, to steer grandparents too for that.
Thank you. Oh, just got some. This just in. Oh, thank you from everybody. Everybody's responding. Thank you. And I think it's about time to draw to a close. I just want to thank you, Sharon, and thanks everybody for being so patient with the technology. It's our learning curve for all of us has been so steep, and it's really nice to have patient folks on the other end, letting us do our thing at our own pace now. We're agile. So it's Sharon, thank you. Signing off. And yeah,
you're welcome. Can I share one thing first?
Please.
This is what I would have had to give all of you. So I put them in a bowl. These are hazelnuts, and which Julian of Norwich, if you go to my website, you'll see why there's meaning of this for me. One of Julian's, famous sayings is that all shall be well. And in this time that we are gathered but dispersed, to find something to hold on to that's tangible, whether it's a holding cross or a walnut or a hazelnut, something of God's creation, that know that all will be well. It may be different, but all will be well. And in God's time, we shall all be together with that. So thank you for having me and inviting me and thinking of creative ways to do this.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, everybody.